let me introduce Sudeep. Sudeep is assistant professor in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. So Sudeep has a BA in philosophy and economics from Tufts University. He also has a PhD in behavioral decision research from Carnegie Mellon University, and he does really exciting work. Basically at the intersection of data science and psychology, I would say. Is that fair to say, Sudeep? He's got some really cool research on judgment and decision making and natural language processing, and he does a lot of other really cool things. And he will talk about these things today in his presentation. So without further ado, Sudeep, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure being here. So my talk's on decision-making, knowledge representation in decision-making, as you can tell by the title. I like to just jump right into the first slide. So here I've put on some questions. These aren't necessarily questions for you. These are questions that people tend to answer on a day-to-day basis. All right? These are questions that form part of people's daily cognitive, psychological lives and that influence their behaviors. All right. The first question: are electronic cigarettes risky? This is, I suppose, a risk perception question. The second question is Philadelphia, the capital of Pennsylvania. That's a factual judgment. Is Donald Trump corrupt? This is a social judgment or even a political judgment. Will California have a major earthquake? I guess a probability forecast for the future. Is granola healthy? Is Uber a friendly company? Health judgments, brand judgments, and so on. Okay, so a lot of research over the past, I would say, 60 years in fields like judgment and decision-making has tried to understand how people answer these questions. And this work has been remarkably influential. It's influenced many different fields, not just psychology, but also marketing, management, organizational behavior, social psychology, economics, neuroscience. This work has won multiple Nobel Prizes, all right? But despite this impact, despite this importance, we still do not have a quantitative theory that can allow us to make quantitative predictions about people's responses to these questions. Okay, we have a lot of great research, but it doesn't take the form of a formal model that can predict naturalistic decisions, such as the ones that I put on the screen in front of you. Okay, here's why. In order to evaluate everyday objects and events, these are objects and events in the world, right? We need to use some knowledge about the world. We need to use some knowledge representations. Research in the behavioral sciences and in related fields, right? It studies how people apply this knowledge, right? The heuristics they may use, for example, but not what the knowledge actually is. All right, going back to these questions, are electronic cigarettes risky? Well, you know what electronic cigarettes are. You know what risk is. You use that knowledge to make a judgment or a decision. I, the researcher, I don't know what you know what electronic cigarettes are. I don't know what you know what risk is. And so I can't really predict your responses to this kind of judgment. And this is the case not just for electronic cigarettes, but really for all natural language or natural entities that can be described using natural language words and phrases. Here's another way to think about this critique. Right at the top, we have beliefs and preferences. This is what behavioral scientists try and do, right? They try and understand people's beliefs and preferences. Now, these beliefs and preferences obviously are based on some knowledge, and behavioral science is very much, or at least a lot of the work in judgment and decision-making and psychology has been very much about understanding how beliefs and preferences emerge from knowledge. For example, again, what kind of heuristic you may use to aggregate your knowledge cues. This work hasn't really investigated the second link, right? Knowledge representations don't exist in isolation. They themselves are formed based on people's information environment, right? Most behavioral science doesn't really look at that. What I'm suggesting is we can use insights from cognitive science, AI, data science, essentially, apply them to people's information environments, the news articles they might read, social media, use that to derive their knowledge representations about the world, and then apply ideas from behavioral scientists to those knowledge representations to then predict people's beliefs and preferences. Okay, so that's really what I'm suggesting we can do. Now, before I get into it, you might be asking, well, how do you extract knowledge from information environments? And kind of part of that, the answer to that problem has to do with, well, how can we formalize knowledge in the first place? Right? One simple approach to formalizing knowledge, to quantifying knowledge, goes under the label vector semantics. So according to this approach, words and concepts, people, places, things, these can be represented as vectors in a semantic space. Right, here I've got e-cigarette. This is a point in the semantic space. And you've got, of course, many other points as well. According to the vector semantic approach, proximity between word vectors is a measure of word association or word relatedness. So e-cigarette is close to vape, which is close to cigarette, which is close to lung cancer, which is close to leukemia. Leukemia is not necessarily close or related to e-cigarettes. Right, so there's a very simple way of thinking about what knowledge is and what concept representation is. What makes this approach particularly powerful is that you can now learn the positions of these word vectors for essentially millions of concepts. You can do that by observing word distribution statistics in natural language, in people's essentially information environments. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail about the technical assumptions that go into training these models. I'll just be using a pre-trained model that was released by Google a few years ago. It's known as the word-to-vec model. It was trained on a 100 billion word Google News corpus, and it has 300 dimensional representations for over 3 million tokens. So here I've got just maybe 20 concepts on a three-dimensional space. This space has 3 million concepts, if you will, on a 300-dimensional space. All right. Now, since then, there have been other approaches to training these kinds of spaces, some that can account for sentence structure and give sentence representations. We have, since this work came out, we have started working with these newer models. They do a little bit better, but most of the results here I'll present with this word-to-vec model, which is perhaps still the best known model of concept representation in this domain. Okay, it's useful to know why this kind of approach is valuable, right? It's not only a nice computational technique. You can get all sorts of NLP data and get representations, get embeddings out of it. Vectors themselves, word vectors, are essentially multi-attribute representations. These are cognitively plausible, and these are, in some sense, one of the main types of representations that cognitive scientists have used over the past couple of decades. And for this reason, the word vectors that I'll be using in today's talk have, in other work, been shown to predict more fundamental aspects of cognitive processing, like similarity judgment and free association and priming effects. Okay, so this is a very popular approach in cognitive science and cognitive psychology. I won't be going into that in too much detail, but we do have a review paper, a fairly recent review paper on this that I can point you towards if you're interested in that. Okay, so again, this is the schematic that I'll be working with. Right at the top with beliefs and preferences. That's what we want to predict. These come from knowledge representations, which are themselves derived from people's information environments. And we can use this vector semantic approach to measure or quantify or perhaps observe these knowledge representations. Essentially, what we'll be doing is taking representational models that have been built on news data and using that to represent the kinds of concepts that people make judgments and decisions about. Now, the last link in this diagram involves mapping knowledge representations onto beliefs and preferences. There are many ways, of course, to do this, but I will, at least for the first half of this talk, use a very well-known and almost fundamental psychological process, and this process can be referred to as association. When I give you a judgment prompt, items that are associated with that judgment prompt are activated and are more likely to be used as responses. Right, this is a well-known heuristic. Steve Sloman, Daniel Kahneman, many of these researchers have argued for this heuristic. Association is a basic memory process. It's quick and easy. It's easy for people to do, and it's also adaptive to the extent that what's in your memory reflects the environment. Of course, in the case presented here, we're explicitly deriving these memory representations from the environment, but for people, typically this link also holds. Okay, so some of you may have come across Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So this would be essentially the thinking fast component, all right, associative judgment. All right. So this is what, at least the first half of this talk will be about. We derive representations from people's information environments, and we look at associations and use that to predict people's beliefs and preferences. All right. Let me give you an example of how we might apply this. I give you a question. X has black fur and orange eyes and likes to sit inside empty boxes. She stares at me while I work. What is X? Is X a car? Is X a cat? Is X a cow? X is in fact a cat. Many of you may have guessed it. Many of you may have used something like an associative judgment heuristic to make that guess. All right. Why? Because words like fur and eyes and stare and sit might be more associated with a cat than a car or a cow. Now, our model can also do this. Here's how we're going to apply it. We take the questions, we break it up into its component words. We take the responses, we break them up into their component words. We obtain vector representations for all of these words from the word to vec embedding space that was essentially trained, again, on Google News. We average these word vectors to get aggregate vectors for questions and responses. So now we have a single word vector, a single representation for black fur with orange eyes who sits in boxes and stares at me while I work. Similarly, a single vector representation for car, another one for cat, another one for cow. Now we can use essentially simple association, which is in this case just the distance between the question vector and the response vector to calculate association. I'm going to use cosine distance or cosine similarity to be more precise, but you can use many other approaches as well. And then we take, as our final step, we use a response with the strongest association to make a prediction. All right, you do this with this question, you get a stronger association between the question and the cat, and so the model predicts cat, right? This is how we're going to try and mimic human associative judgment involving natural entities, natural questions, and so on and so forth. All right, to give you perhaps a more representative example of the kind of question that psychologists have studied, here's a Linda problem. Many of you may have come across it before. So Linda is described as a single, outspoken, bright philosophy major. As a student, she was concerned about discrimination, social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Is she more likely to be a bank teller or a feminist bank teller? Well, if we ask our model to make a judgment, the model will take words like discrimination and social justice, it'll associate them with feminism, and will give a higher response to feminist bank teller. Okay, note that this is incorrect because all feminist bank tellers are also bank tellers. Therefore, it's impossible for someone to be a feminist bank teller and not bank teller. Therefore, it's also impossible for feminist bank teller to have a higher probability of describing Linda than bank teller. Nonetheless, this is what people do, and so our model mimics that behavior. And it does so, again, based on the association between the words that make up the response and the words that make up the question. An associative judgment process, such as the type our model instantiates, will lead to violations of simple conjunction rules in language, such as the ones, such as feminist bank teller. Okay, this is obviously a well-known idea. It's not something that I've come up with. Kahneman, Tversky, and many others have spent a lot of time analyzing these kinds of problems. In fact, there is a massive literature in the judgment and decision-making world that looks at variants of this problem, that tries to understand variants of, that tries to explain this problem using other models, and then has variants of these problems to support these alternate theoretical interpretations. There are also alternate fallacy problems. So this was a conjunction fallacy. There are disjunction fallacies, there are base rate neglect fallacies. What I've done is I've collected all of these problems that have been used in this literature, at least all the problems that I could find. And I also got participants to generate similar problems for me. The beauty of this model is that you can essentially give it any question, it will give you a prediction. So for the first time now, you can start quantitatively predicting a priori people's responses and fallacy rates in this classical research area. And what we find when we do this is, on average, we're about to predict 30% of the variance on average across these different data sets. Note that we're predicting 30% of the variance in many of these sort of initial experiments, right? So for example, looking at this typicality experiment here that I'm pointing my cursor over, okay, Shafir et al. Back in 1990 had a number of these problems that was in their appendix. They gave it to the participants, and they showed the fallacy rates in one of their tables. So we're trying to predict the actual original fallacy rates that they observed, right? And that's the metric for which we get something like a 0.29 R square on average, right? So what this suggests is that we can explain a fair amount of variance in fallacy rates using our model. And of course, our model is unique because no other model can actually even make predictions for these kinds of judgment problems, at least not without getting additional participant data. Okay, here's another example of how we can apply this model. We can use it to predict people's forecasts. So in this study, I asked participants to judge the probability of various natural and man-made disasters in different countries. So what's the probability there'll be an earthquake in Japan next year? I ran a version of the study in which participants judged the probability of various famous people winning an award. For example, Taylor Swift wins an Academy Award in 2020. The goal in this case was to see whether human forecasts could be well predicted by the model's association. So association between earthquake in Japan or Taylor Swift and Academy Award could perhaps be used to predict the probabilities that participants assigned to these events in our studies. Okay? So there were really 8 studies, and the results of these studies are shown in these 8 scatter plots. So the top studies are probabilities of terrorist attack or war or earthquake or epidemic in various countries. So each point corresponds to a country. On the y-axis is the average probability judgment given to that event happening in that country by participants. So, there's a high probability of there being a terrorist attack in this specific country. On the x-axis is our model's association between that country and the word terrorist attack, the phrase terrorist attack. And in the bottom, we've got the same thing, but for different people winning awards, the President, Nobel Prize, Grammy Award, Academy Award. In all cases, we're able to actually describe or sort of predict people's predictions, predict people's forecasts with a high degree of accuracy. On average, we're getting about 0.43 R square. So again, we can use this approach now to make a priori predictions of people's predictions, of people's forecasts, if you will. The model, by the way, does get some things wrong, which tells you that people are not using only associations. So for example, this point over here, that the model essentially gives a high probability to, but people give a low probability to, that's Vietnam. All right, so Vietnam and war are very strongly associated, but no one thinks that there's going to be a war in Vietnam in the next few years, at least not more so. That's not more likely than war in many other countries. So the model makes a mistake there, or sort of model mispredicts people's predictions there. And so that kind of tells you where the model is making mistakes. Okay. I'll give you another couple of examples. So we've got factual judgment problems taken from quizzes and game shows. City size judgment problems, for those of you who are familiar with a lot of the heuristic judgment research. For some reason, this research is quite interested in getting participants to judge relative city sizes. So it's like, is Berlin bigger than some other, whatever, Frankfurt or whatever, some other German city. The research in that space has looked at recognition as a cue to predict people's judgments. Here we find that we can just use association with the question prompt to predict pretty well. And then lastly, we can also go on actual game shows. So on Jeopardy, which is a well-known game show, we can actually try and predict participants' responses on that game show, the real incentivized game show participants. And in all cases, we can actually describe participant factual judgment with a fair degree of accuracy. And that's factual judgment. We've also applied it to other domains. So for example, we can predict social associations like prejudices and biases for different social categories. We can apply a similar approach to predicting decisions from memory. What do you feel like eating for breakfast? Some of these decisions can be predicted by just the association of, say, food items with the judgment prompt. And in the last 2 examples that I've presented here, we're looking at, in one case, either political judgments across different groups, and in this experiment was essentially judgments for Trump and Clinton during the 2016 election. And what we did was we trained these models separately on different information environments. So one set of models was trained on liberal news media sources, one was trained on conservative news media sources within the United States, and we tried to sort of predict the differences in association between Trump and Clinton and various traits. In the second example, we're again training different models on different information environments. In this case, the information environments are taken from different time periods. So we train these models on different decades of English language, and then we predict changes in gender associations over time. In both cases, I don't have too much time to get into them in detail. I'm obviously happy to elaborate at the end of this talk. But in both cases, what we're doing is we're not just trying to predict a single group, but we're predicting now differences across groups. In fact, in some cases, we're even using this approach to retrospectively observe these differences. Like, you never go back in time and ask someone from, say, 1950 to tell you about their gender stereotypes, but you can now proxy those gender stereotypes by training these models and observing their predictions on natural language from the 1950s. So I think this is a particularly powerful illustration of this method. Okay. Just to give you an example of how some of these sort of social trait predictions may work, this is, again, our word to vet model, which was trained back in 2013. All right. So this is way before 2016 election, way before Trump came on the political stage. We can ask that model, the pre-2016 model, to essentially sort of measure the association between Trump and Clinton and various trait words. And we do get some interesting patterns, right? So Hillary Clinton is seductive but motherly. She's violent and she's tense. She's also remarkable. Trump is greedy and conceited and cocky and arrogant. He's selfish. He's strict and he's big. Okay, this perhaps gives you some insight of into what might have been going on in voters' minds back in 2016. Obviously, we could also run a sort of 2020 version of this study. We haven't really done that, but that could maybe tell you about how these associations have evolved. Okay, so that's a brief summary of how we can use associations, models of association, applied to representations derived from people's information environments to start predicting people's beliefs and preferences. Right? You can use it to predict classic findings in probability judgment, but also things like factual judgment, social judgment, changes in judgment over time and across different groups, memory-based decision-making, and we have a couple of other applications as well that I haven't really talked about. Now I want to say, well, what if we don't care about association? Right? What if we don't care about the psychology behind it? What do we just want to see if we can just use these representations and use them in some sense in a data-driven manner to predict people's beliefs and preferences? No talk of associations here. We're just going to try and predict data by training our models on a subset of the data. So maybe that can give you really good predictions as well. Maybe that can give you better predictions than simple association. Let's see. All right, how would this work? Okay, so let's say we're asking participants to judge the riskiness of different things. So e-cigarettes, how risky is e-cigarettes? How risky is marijuana? How risky is electricity? All right. We get participant risk ratings for these concepts. And what we do essentially to predict those risk ratings is not necessarily to look at the association between the concept and some word like risk or danger or something, but rather just we take that data and we learn a mapping from this 300-dimensional embedding space that projects that space onto this one-dimensional risk rating. Okay, if we build this mapping, we can perhaps now take new risk sources, let's say nuclear power, and pass it through that mapping and make a prediction out of sample about how risky people will find nuclear power to be. Right, so that's what we looked at. We asked participants to rate the riskiness of different risk sources, technological risks, activity-based risks, and so there were 3 studies. So in one study there was technological risks, in another study there were activity-based risks, and in another study we asked participants to generate risks and then sort of rate them. Essentially, this is what the decision prompt looked like. So how risky are, say, cell phones? And risk it rate from -100 to +100. So -100 is safe, +100 is risky. Right? That's what we wanted to predict. And as I said earlier, the way we would perhaps do this is by taking the vector representation of the risk source, mapping it onto a risk rating. We train that mapping using our training data, and then perhaps take an out-of-sample risk source that has a vector representation in our model, and then apply the mapping to it to predict participants' risk ratings for that risk source out of sample. Right. Now we wanted to compare how well this approach does against leading approaches in psychology for modeling risk perception. For that, we use this classic psychometric approach that's been popularized by Baruch Fishoff and Paul Slovic. What this approach essentially does is it gets more data from participants, essentially. So in order to predict the judged riskiness of cell phones, what this work does is it then asks participants to rate cell phones on a number of additional dimensions. For example, are individuals exposed to this risk voluntarily or involuntarily, or is death from this risk immediate or delayed, and so on and so forth. And then, getting the psychometric data, it essentially then regresses risk ratings onto responses to these kinds of survey problems to then predict risk ratings. Okay, and it's important to note that this approach, it's the dominant approach in psychology, but it is pretty data intensive. If you want to predict the risk for, let's say, whatever, nuclear power, if that's your out of sample risk, you still need to get like people to judge nuclear power on various psychometric dimensions. So at the end of it, it needs about 10 times as much participant data relative to the word embedding approach that uses essentially representations derived from natural language to proxy what people know about these risk sources. Okay, but you can, once you get that survey data, you can essentially use that data in the same way that you'd use word embeddings or these vector semantic representations. In this case, you've got a 9-dimensional psychometric vector that's composed of people's survey responses for these risk sources. You're going to regress that onto the risk rating, build a model there, and then apply it to an out-of-sample risk source. If there are questions about any of these technical issues, I'm fine with people interrupt and just like ask me to clarify. I mean, it's up to you, but I'm fine with being interrupted if there's a major sort of technical issue that's not clear.
Yeah, I mean, in that case, guys, if you have any technical questions, please raise a virtual hand so I know who has a question. Okay, otherwise we'll take the questions later.
Okay, well, I'll continue, and Ghana, you can just interrupt me whenever someone has a question.
Yeah, I'll monitor that. Okay, thank you.
All right, wonderful, thanks. All right, so how well does our approach do? Well, the semantic vector approach does roughly as well as a psychometric approach. It requires 10 times less data, but it's able to get similar R-square. So for technological risks, both get around 0.5 R-square. For activity risks, the psychometric approach does around 0.7, and semantic vector does around 0.6 R-square. And again, for participant-generated risk, they both do around 0.7 R-square. This is in predicting out-of-sample, and it's a 10% out-of-sample cross-validation exercise. We've got a ridge regression model applied on top of the word vector embeddings. I can go into many of these details if someone wants to know more. I think one of the more interesting results from this study is that the combined approach, where you essentially combine the psychometric vectors as sort of survey-based, psychological, with the semantic vectors that's sort of language-based, data science-y. You combine them, now you're getting some massive predictions. 0.7, 0.8, even close to 0.9 R-squared. I think it tells that perhaps semantic vectors and these psychometric vectors, they're capturing different aspects of the underlying representation. So maybe they can be used in conjunction, right? These are not competing approaches. I would say they're complementary approaches. Okay. So again, this is how the vector approach would work. You take these vector representations, you map them onto the dimension that you're interested in. In this case, it's riskiness. And this is different from what we were doing earlier when we were just looking at similarity in the underlying vector space, and we were using that similarity to predict people's responses. But wait a second, is it really all that different? What if you have a linear mapping? Well, if you have a linear mapping, like with, let's say, a ridge regression, then implicitly what that mapping is picking up is a latent representation of risk, such that associations, or let's say proximity to that latent representation, is essentially what that regression model is predicting. Okay, and this latent risk representation, in this case, it's just given by the weight vector that's picked up by the ridge regression model. Okay, again, happy to go into more technical details. There's some assumptions that need to be made, like the vectors are normalized, but once you have that, then essentially a linear regression is essentially using association implicitly. And what you can do with that trained regression model is sort of figure out what that association actually is, right? You can sort of use the regression model to tell you, hey, if people were using associations, what were those associations? And then you apply this to this kind of data set, you find some fairly reasonable associations. So, for technological risks, that latent risk representation is close to words like drug, substance, illegal, conspiracy. For activity risk, helmet, dangerous, fatal, crash. For participant-generated risks, tragedy, terror, violence, coup, bombing. I suppose if we ran this study today, you'd also get participant-generated risks like, global pandemic. Now, once you get the underlying latent risk representation, right, which is essentially the words and concepts that are sort of close to that point that's revealed by the regression model, you can now start doing some psychology on top of that. You can say, hey, all these words and concepts, which emotions are they strongest on? And then, you can use essentially various emotion dictionaries and test that, and we find, as would perhaps be expected, that a lot of these words are closer to fear than they are to many other emotions. And you can do all sorts of other sort of nuanced psychological tests, this time on the associations that are revealed by the participant rating. So I think there's some psychological value to this. You're not just trying to predict out a sample. You can also tell you what are the latent associations that are driving people's judgments. Right, and this approach is remarkably flexible. It's also very powerful. What we've done in follow-up work is taken this idea and just try to predict, in a single study, responses across various domains and subfields of psychology. So in this in this study we had, we're trying to predict the judged masculinity and femininity of traits. Again, whether different risk sources are considered dread-inducing or unknowable, warmth and confidence of people, taste and nutrition of food, significance and autonomy of occupations, sincerity and excitement of brands, and hedonic and utilitarian values of goods. So again, taking different sort of judgment dimensions from all across psychology and behavioral sciences, management, marketing, fields like that. So we got data from participants on all these dimensions. We had roughly 140,000 judgments for about 1,400 entities on 14 different judgment dimensions. And our goal was to use this approach to sort of predict these judgments. And we were able to do very well, like on R-square for around 0.58 across all these domains. And this was very close to the split half correlation, or split half R-square that we would get using only the participant data. So we're getting very close to the upper bound in our predictive accuracy. Essentially one model, one method can be used across different settings to predict participant judgments and decisions. And we're using, again, a similar set of models to examine some of these domains in more detail. So brand perception, leadership perception, numerical judgment processing. We also have some work with people at Warwick on nutrition labeling. Can we predict the health judgments for different food items using the word embedding representations for those foods? And then can we perhaps also predict the effect of various interventions like nutritional labels on those foods? You can build essentially a machine learning model that can tell you for like any food out there, how healthy people will judge it to be, and how a nutrition label will influence those health judgments. So there's all sorts of, I think, practical applications there as well. All right. So back to this diagram, right? Beliefs and preferences, that's what we want to try and predict. These can be predicted from knowledge representations derived from people's information environments. And the way we're predicting them is with association, either explicit association, like without training, or with training, using something like a regression model that in some sense reveals latent associations that people may be using. Okay? In all cases, we're able to predict beliefs and preferences pretty accurately.
Sudeep, we have a question from Shweta. Shweta, do you want to go ahead with your question? You have a raised hand.
Yep. Hi,
so if you,
if
you could, sorry, Shweta, can just also for everyone, can you introduce yourself before you start with your question? And please, if possible, start kind of rolling your camera when you're asking the question. Thanks a lot.
Absolutely. So Sudeep, I'm an assistant professor at the Warwick Business School. I do very similar research to what you're doing, and I'm very excited and very happy to hear you. It's very exciting work. The question which kind of came to my mind, the first thing is that you are talking about the accuracy of these algorithm, and the underlying idea is that it all depends upon what training data you have used, how well you have trained the models, and then the question becomes, well, does it suffer from the bias, the bias we have been talking about in the AI, and if yes, how do you handle that? What is the best mechanism, or how do you make sure it doesn't affect the results what you're getting, right?
Right. So here's there is definitely bias, and that's a good thing for us because humans are also biased, and we want to use our model to mimic humans. Okay. Now I don't want to say bias is good. It's not good. If you're building AI that's going to help people and solve their problems and has essentially uses to that interact with people, right? You're building AI like a virtual assistant. Well, yeah, obviously you don't want it to be biased, and you got to do a lot of things. But if you're trying to build a model that just mimics human psychology, then, well, humans have biases. Can we predict those biases through the model's biases? And in fact, in some of our work, we've done that, essentially taking, essentially IAT responses and training our models on, natural language data sets and predicting some of those IAT responses. And this is work that's been done by many people, not just us, as you'd be familiar with. So those biases are in the case, at least in the social setting, present and beneficial in the sense that they allow us to mimic human biases, which are present. Okay, of course, human biases are not necessarily good in a deeper sense. So that's social biases. There are also other biases. So I'll give you one example. Right? Is granola healthy? Right? Granola is this made of almonds and that sort of thing, and people think it's healthy. Okay, but it's not that healthy. If you look at it, it's a lot of sugar, it's a lot of fat, and you ask nutritionists, and they say no, that is not a healthy product. Same with orange juice. You ask people, orange juice is healthy. Why? It's not orange juice. It's natural. It's fruit. Well, actually, orange juice is full of sugar. Okay. When we apply our models to predict health judgment, we find that they too are biased, like humans. They associate orange juice, granola with natural related words, and subsequently give it a higher health judgment. Humans are also biased, right? And in fact, we're using our model to predict the human biases. That's why the model's biases are useful there as well. Now, of course, you can use now this approach to perhaps correct human biases by predicting a priori, again, the kinds of food items that people will incorrectly associate with health. And that's just two examples, but I think the similar approach applies to other domains. Is Philadelphia the capital of Pennsylvania? Well, Philadelphia it is associated with Pennsylvania. It's actually not the capital of Pennsylvania. Harrisburg is the capital of Pennsylvania. There's similar biases that go into factual judgment. So in Jeopardy, for example, we can predict the actual errors made by human participants in Jeopardy game show, like in the real Jeopardy game show with real world stakes. We can predict those errors or those biases by looking at the associative biases within our own model. So I guess that was a pretty wide-ranging response. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it does. I'll be happy to talk more offline to you later, maybe.
Absolutely, I would love that.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Okay, we have also a question from Dong. Dong, please unmute yourself, ask your question.
Hi, thanks for this very interesting talk so far. So I'm an assistant professor at Utrecht in the computer science department, but I also work with social scientists who are very interested in modeling survey questions and answers. So it's kind of a follow-up question because, so to what extent do you focus on the data that you give to the model? Because if you compare against participant ratings, these participants have certain demographics, but the data that you have from that was used to train a word-to-vec model might be from people whose demographics you have no idea about. So to what extent does it matter if the data matches in terms of characteristics, in terms of the groups, if it matters the participant ratings that you compare against? For example, also whether someone is coming from the UK or the US, and whether the data is the word-to-vec data comes from the UK or US or something else.
Right. No, that's a really good question. So, so to the extent that participant demographics matter in the studies that we've done, we found that those differences tend to emerge most strongly in ideologically laden domains. So, as an example, we have a study of, say, leadership perception. All right, and we're asking participants to judge the suitability of various leaders. Our media is, I would say, fairly liberal leaning, or it's like, centrist liberal. Most of our participants are also actually in that space, but there's a subset of our participants that are sort of these, like, I'd call them fake news Republicans. All right. So the embedding models are not trained on fake news, so they can't really predict their judgments as well as they can the predictions of, let's say, the majority of our participants who are, let's say, whose information environment is aligned with the information environment on which our models are trained. So that's one thing. In other studies, we have actually trained separate models on Republican and on conservative and liberal media, and use that to predict differences in association between Trump and Clinton. That's a little bit different. It's actually, there's some issues with that work that I'm happy to talk about maybe later, that they don't necessarily involve ideological biases, but they don't involve essentially demographics as much as they involve the complexity of human psychology and how simple association may not get at that. But I do see what you mean. I mean, I think there are other settings in which, let's say, at least in the American context, African Americans may differ from white Americans, and our media might be primarily reflecting the interests of white Americans. We haven't really looked at a specific setting that has that characteristic, but maybe there are settings. We have a study with occupations, so I think there might be, say, gender biases in occupational preference. That again, our model may reflect one set of perspectives and not the others. I think that's something that we could also look into. This is a very good question. This is an important question, right? And actually, let me give you like my thought about the bigger issue underlying this question. The bigger issue is that these models are data intensive, so you need a lot of data, which means like you can't train different versions of this model on data that idiosyncratically reflects a given participant's information environment. Like I don't have a data set that reflects Ghana's information environment, so I can't train a Ghana-specific model. I can't use it to predict Ghana's responses. Okay, so that's a bigger issue that I think these models have, that in fact most data science approaches to mimicking human cognition have. The more data you need, the harder it is to get at individual level idiosyncrasies and heterogeneities. Now, that said, I can imagine a not too distant, perhaps dystopian future in which participants come into my lab and they consent to sharing their whatever Google histories or whatever Apple histories or Amazon histories, whatever, and we can at that moment essentially access their lifetime information environment, build models to capture their idiosyncratic representations of the world and start predicting their behavior. That's my dream of a future experiment. I don't think it's feasible right now.